Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, everyone here in the room and online can hear me well enough. Welcome. Appreciate you all being here in the room. Appreciate our audience online as well to our first district dialogues in the Charlotte office so far this year. We've got some folks that are still coming in and sitting down, and I think we still have people joining us online, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So this first event of the year is entitled What's Next for the Economy of the Carolinas? And so that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to start with a little bit of overview, and then we'll bring in some panelists. But we want to get your input first. So if you're here in the room or online, this will be important for Q&A along the way and afterwards as well. Go ahead and get on the Slido app here by looking at the QR, getting your phones and using the QR code. I'm going to ask you all a couple of questions to get the creative juices flowing. Give us some insight into kind of where you are as you look at the world. I suppose I could, while you're all doing that, tell an economist joke or two. But there's really only like 3 jokes about economists. The rest of them are true stories. That's my baseline economics joke. So I generally don't tell jokes about economists. We kind of tell them on ourselves. Give us enough time. All right, everybody think that mic's a little loud. All right, so if you've got that, we'll go to the first question, see how this goes. And this is really, I'm just curious about where folks are coming at us from work-wise. If you want to put in your industry, I think there are 8 or 9 options here, I think. So we're only going to see the top 6 or so on the screen. But if you're on your Slido, you hopefully can see something that's relevant to you. Banking and finance, that's probably not too surprising. Others, the catch-all, others going to get it. Not quite. Government, education, construction. Got a pretty good mix. Okay, looks like it's settling down. Oh, not quite. Not quite. Okay, that's good mix. Gives others taking over. I think it's going to keep the lead. Okay, gives a little insight of where you all are coming from and where questions might be. Let's go on to the next one then. In one word, I think this will be a word cloud. How would you characterize the regional economy? And you can define region however it works for you. Charlotte, wherever you sit, a whole state, North Carolina, South Carolina, whatever works for you. We'll start to see some answers come up here. Oh, it's just going to be a stream of answers. A couple of resilience in there, a couple of strongs, growings, thriving. I like that. There's a lot of positive words showing up. Very strong with exclamation points. Choppy, there we go. Unknown. Okay, it's not universal. Questionable. Unstable, okay. Diverse. Okay. We got some interesting, okay, so we've got a number of strongs, mixed, uncertains, confusing. Anxious, yeah. Okay, this is interesting. Boom. K-shaped, okay. That's a word a couple of years ago, probably nobody ever heard. I guess it's not a word. Okay. Uninspiring. Okay, this is really interesting. My takeaway from this is in some sense, there's not one economy, and you'll see this when we talk about some of the regional dispersion as well. And of course, you all are coming at it from different seats across the economy, so what you say may be different than what others, okay? Really interesting. Thank you for that. What concerns you the most about the national economy? Ask the question about regional. See what we get when we think about the national economy. This one's the word cloud one. Big inflation, okay. This is kind of fun. I see a number of topics popping up there that we probably won't have time to get to today. But what we'll do is we'll keep this in mind. In November, we're going to have another one here in Charlotte, and that one will probably be topical. We'll do a little bit of a regional economic update, but we'll probably pick a topic that's relevant, do something a little more specific. Looks like inflation's holding on there. Unstable leadership in yellow or pretty big, unpredictable instability, bubble, AI, politics, debt. Okay, there's some really good stuff there. Okay, and I don't think I'm surprised that inflation is probably the biggest word there. You know, I've been married for 26 years, and I still have this experience where I'll get home, and my wife will say, "Do you know how much groceries cost?" It's like I'm a little bit aware. It's part of the job. Okay, thank you. That's really good. All right, this next one's an either or, and this relates to our dual mandate as the nation's central bank. Which is the bigger concern, inflation or employment? So now let's just pick one of two. Given the last slide, I'm not surprised inflation's in front. Given where most of us sit, certainly in this room, and I looked at the guest list of who's online, lots of people in places that seem to be doing pretty well. So inflation it looks like it's really stabilizing there around inflation. Okay, thank you. That's really interesting and really helpful. Let me go through a few slides of an economic update. Before I do that, though, just a word on kind of the vantage point we have. So those that are here present, you're in the Charlotte branch of the Federal Reserve Bank Richmond, one of 12 reserve banks that make up the system. You all came through security to get in here, not because we are particularly concerned about the safety of the people that work here. It's because underneath our feet, actually over in the corner, is a very large vault filled with cash. So we have to put some protection around that. So we're engaged in payment type services. Most or the largest group of people that work in this building, though, are actually engaged in bank supervision in one form or another. We've got a couple of big banks down the street. We've got lots of stuff going on there. But then we have some of us that support monetary policy and our community development efforts that are engaged in our district. So you see a map of our district, Maryland and West Virginia down through South Carolina. Out of this office, we pay attention to the Carolinas. We're trying to talk in real time to businesses to get real time insights that are useful for monetary policy decision making, right? So we spend a lot of time, you can see some of the numbers up there. Last year, across our district, this isn't just the Charlotte team, we talked to nearly 4,000 business and community leaders in that effort. We've got a lot of different venues that we do that. So our vantage point is we, of course, track the data, and I'm going to show you some of that. But we have these regular conversations that provide pretty deep insights into how businesses are thinking about their decision-making and what they're doing in response to events in the world. So we'll go through that. One of the newer initiatives we have is taking some of those insights and then every monetary policy cycle just saying, here's what we think we heard this last cycle. We've only been doing this, I think, for about 6 months. That QR code takes you to the page, but if you go to our website, you can find this. What businesses are saying is the series that we're putting out. And it'll come out within a week after a monetary policy meeting. That's about how long it takes before it's out. All right, so how is the economy doing? Let's start at the national level with the big picture of real GDP. And what you see in this chart is the blue bars are quarter in changes in real GDP. The last few quarters, it's been pretty good, right? But we only have data through the first quarter, which is interesting. We're early in the third quarter. We won't get for another 3 weeks the first read on the second quarter. It's another reason why you talk to businesses. Data comes in with a pretty significant lag. The economy is growing pretty well. This is the only one that has a forecast from members of the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, from their last meeting in June. And it's pretty much a steady 2% growth forecast. That's a pretty good rate of growth. Year over year, the US economies are sitting as of the end of the first quarter, grew about 2.7%. And that's despite everything that's happened in the last few years. When we did that word cloud, the word resilient came up a few times, and I think that's the right description. The economy is pretty resilient. It's taken some shots, but we're still growing at a pretty good clip, faster than most of the developed world. I keep thinking of, and I'm looking around the room, there are enough of you of an age that remember the old Timex ads, right? Takes a licking and keeps on ticking. That's the US economy, right? We're still resilient in doing that. It doesn't mean it's universally good everywhere. Again, in the word cloud, someone put in K-shape, this idea that higher income households are doing better than lower income households that are really struggling economically and having to make some pretty significant choices. So those things are out there, but overall it looks pretty good. On the labor market side, it's very unusual, however. So this is the level of payroll employment for the US economy going back to 2007. And there's a trend line in there. It's not scientific at all. It's just, I was really trying to get the trend line to match the increase in jobs. Roughly that 2015 to 29 period was a really steady increase. And then I've extended it out. And where we're sitting today, we're not on that trend line, right? You see the sharp drop in COVID, pretty rapid recovery, but we don't get back to the previous trend line. And the slope of that line has flattened out considerably. Thankfully, in the last few months, it started to kick up again a little bit, right? So when you look at this, you say employment doesn't appear to be where it should be. We're going to talk about some of the details behind that. This looks a little, not scary, but concerning. But then when you look at other measures in the labor market, they aren't as concerning. So this is the unemployment rate going all the way back to 1950. We're at 4.2% now, and I've drawn a horizontal line there at about that level. And there aren't many periods in my lifetime that we've been at or below the current 4.2%. The last several years, a few years before COVID hit, you have to go back right before the 2001 recession for the previous time. And then the previous time before that, I was a toddler, right? Back in the late 60s. So it is not all that typical for the unemployment rate to be as low as it is today. It is also true, though, a couple of years ago, it was only 3.5%, and it's been slowly drifting higher. It's been pretty steady the last several months, though. The implication is that the supply of labor is also not growing as fast as it once was, right? If we're not adding as many jobs, but the unemployment rate's not going up a lot, then where we're sitting today is in a labor market that still looks overall fairly healthy, despite the lower number of jobs being added on a monthly basis. If you want to see how this looks in the Carolinas, similar line, payroll employment, similar trend line that's again, not scientific, just trying to get a gauge here. North Carolina is sort of back on trend to where it was pre-COVID. It's been above, it's been below, flattened out last year, and you can see again, like the US economy, it's sort of kicked up in the last few months. South Carolina is roughly similar, not quite back to that same trend line, but that line in the last couple of years is pretty steady upward trend in job growth, right? So both of those look pretty good. Regionally, we get data at lots of different regional levels. This is at the metropolitan statistical level, metropolitan statistical area level, and it's year-over-year growth for our latest data. So May of this year compared to May of last year. It's percentage changes. The US is in there in dark blue, and the overall growth rate for North Carolina is in the lighter blue, considerably faster than the US rate. So the state as a whole is seeing much faster job growth than we're seeing in the nation. And when you look at the metropolitan statistical areas, the bigger ones are at the higher end there, right? Raleigh and Charlotte are up there, Winston-Salem. Wilmington's at the very top, not quite as large. The ones at the bottom, though, some of which are have seen negative growth, tend to be the smaller MSAs. And I'd also note, without having a real explanation for this, Jacksonville, Goldsboro, Fayetteville, those are all post towns as well. So they've got a little bit different dynamic to them than some of the other places. The point here is, even in a state that is overall growing quite quickly, there is a lot of regional variation. And this is just the metropolitan areas. If you looked at the rural counties, not in an MSA, you'd probably have even more variation as well. It's a similar story in South Carolina, looking across the MSAs, except here over the last year, the two fastest growing ones for jobs are on the coast, right? Myrtle Beach and Hilton Head are both growing quite quickly. Greenville, South Carolina is growing pretty quickly. You see South Carolina as a whole, not over the last year, not quite as fast growth as North Carolina in terms of percentage of jobs, but still considerably faster than the US as a whole. So again, regional dispersion, not everywhere is growing as quickly or looks quite as healthy. Then we come back to something then to sort of square a circle at the US level. We talked about growth overall. Real GDP looks pretty solid, but with not a lot of employment growth. When you do growth accounting, you can get an increase in real GDP by either putting more people to work or having the people that are working be more productive. What this chart is showing you that we've had in recent years a fairly sizable kick up in growth and productivity, which means even though job growth isn't as strong as it had been 10 years ago, because productivity is stronger, we're still keeping up pretty well as far as real GDP growth. What is interesting, and maybe the panelists will talk about this, is everybody wants to talk about AI. When we talk to businesses around our district, a lot of this productivity growth is not tied to AI. It's just firms doing things better, smarter, more organized fashion. If they're in manufacturing, maybe coming out of COVID, they couldn't find workers, so they put in some automation. That's finally bearing fruit, and we're seeing that. Not that AI is not having an impact, but I don't think this increase so far is primarily due to AI based on what we're hearing in our outreach. All right, and then finally, you have a Federal Reserve economist in front of you. Inflation was a big concern. We've got to talk about just level setting where inflation is at the US level. Here's personal consumption expenditures price index, which is a mouthful. The dotted line is our 2% target over the medium term. You can see as of the May data, we won't get June data till the end of this month. We're at 4%. We had been in this 2.5% to 3% range. Global events have pushed particularly oil prices and anything that's dependent on them up a bit, so inflation's picked up. We'll see what happens in June. If you all drive, you can see gas prices are off a peak, so we'll probably get some pullback in energy prices in the June data. If you take out the volatile food and energy and just look at core, that's gone up quite a bit as well. And again, in our outreach to businesses, fuel surcharges are common on anything that is shipped, right? So there's additional cost pressure, some of which is getting passed on to consumers. All right, so that's the quick overview. I'm going to put the Slido thing up. If you weren't on before, here it is. You can re-engage. This is how you're going to ask questions during our panel discussion. And I'm not a very good multitasker, but I'm going to go through, invite our panelists up in a second, and I'm going to be monitoring the questions and trying to ask them in real time. So let me ask my panelists to come up. First, Laura Ulrich, who's the Director of Research at Indeed and a former colleague of ours, so she's very familiar with these rooms, and Bethany Green, our regional economist who works here, so she's also very familiar with these rooms as well. So we're going to have a bit of a discussion. Again, you can have the questions come in as we talk. All right. It's like a staff meeting from a few months ago, right? We can just sit here and have a conversation. So this is the title for this event is What's Next for the Economies of the Carolinas. So we're going to focus on the regional economy. And I'll just start with each of you with the general question. When you look at the region, the Carolinas, or even below that, what stands out to you as kind of the salient features of what's happening in the economy, strengths, weaknesses, that sort of thing, overall picture? And Laura, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I was one of the people that said I thought this economy is resilient. There have been a lot of bumps along the way, lots of uncertainty, for the past 2 years when people have asked me, like, what do you think is characterizing much of the behavior in the economy? Uncertainty is the answer I would give for that. But beneath that, or even alongside the uncertainty, there's also been a lot of resilience. And I think this part of the country really stands out as one of the most resilient areas. For all the reasons Matt's already mentioned, also like in our data at Indeed, North Carolina and South Carolina have job postings that still far exceed what most of the rest of the country looks like. And interestingly, the growth in job postings, if you compare like pre-COVID to now, it's grown a larger percentage than the population has. So that's pretty good news, right? One of the things that really stands out to me about the Carolinas, and I've lived here now for 19 years, which is crazy, is that a lot of the reasons that I think the Carolinas have remained really resilient, and that's everything from quality of life and weather, which we all know very well, right? I mean, I don't know how many times since I've lived here, people have talked about we're 2 hours from the ocean and 2 hours from the mountains. And that becomes cliche, but it's also true. And people like the ocean and mountains. So that helps us. So a lot of those things are not going to change. So regardless of what happens in the broader US economy, I believe that this part of the country will be on the positive end of outcomes. It's
funny you say that. I had a couple of conversations before we started this event. Someone had just been to the mountains and someone had just been to the beach.
Yeah, exactly.
So
it's easy,
it works.
Right?
It works.
And it is things like, people ask me like, oh, why have you lived in Charlotte for 19 years? I'm like, really, the answer is the airport. And that sounds so ridiculous, but I can get anywhere I want to go very quickly, right? And when I've looked at moving other places, I'm like, oh, but the airport, So those types of infrastructure, the access to both North and South Carolina have a high number of interstate per miles per square, acreage for the states. Those sorts of things aren't going to change. So when companies are looking to where to locate and when people are choosing where to move, the Carolinas are going to remain really at the top of that list, in my opinion, because of those things.
Bethany.
Yeah, I would echo that, Laura. I also when I think about the Carolinas, I just think about energy. I think about momentum. And I think that's what we're experiencing right now. And we've seen that even more so over the past, I'd say like 5-6 years. And, we're seeing a lot of growth in population. We can really attract people to come to the Carolinas. And we're also, I feel like we've really labeled ourselves as like business friendly. And I think that has paid off for us in our ability to attract new business, new industry. I think, there's been a lot of focus on economic development, and I think that has absolutely paid off. I'd point to, in terms of weaknesses, I also think that growth is like this double-edged sword. So when I think about, our infrastructure needs, and I think that's also something to point to. So for example, a big topic that comes up is like housing availability, housing affordability, and how that has changed in response to all the growth that we've seen, transportation as well, and some of the strain that we see there. So I think that is something to point to. Then also something that Matt alluded to earlier is, the growth that we're seeing is very much concentrated in specific areas, right? So when we look at our metros, our major metros, Charlotte, Raleigh, we look at upstate South Carolina, Greenville, seeing a lot of growth there. But is that growth really spreading out to some of our, rural areas, for example? Are we seeing that spread out evenly? Not necessarily. So I kind of point to those things as, some of the weaknesses that come up quite a bit as well.
One other, since I didn't mention weakness, but one of the things you said made me think about this. We're actually working right now at Indeed, so don't quote me on this, but we're working on this labor market tightness index that looks at by MSA across the country, like what parts of the country is there a lot of slack, which means there's like too much labor supply. And interestingly, in that metric, this part of the country does not look great, which was a surprise to me because and we'll publish a piece on this by the end of the month, and you'll see that there, in terms of kind of the color coding of the map, we look a lot like California in some areas. But the reason for that is that people in our Indeed data are having to search really hard for jobs. The intensity of job search is really high. And so we were talking internally, and I was sharing, because I'm kind of the person from the team that's from this region, and I was sharing with people, I think some of that is because of the skills mismatch that's happening here, right? The growth we're seeing of people moving in from Charlotte to Charlotte and Raleigh and Greenville, South Carolina, and Charleston, a lot of those are college educated white collar workers. And a lot of the growth, I mentioned like job postings in this area have remained really high. That strength is being driven by production and manufacturing, leisure and hospitality. So that's a mismatch, right? So it's a really, if you're listening to this or here today and you're searching for a job in finance in Charlotte right now, it's a hard time. It's not easy. It's really hard. And it might be as hard as it would be to search for a job in California in finance, but for totally different reasons, not because demand's not high, but because there's a mismatch of supply. And so I do think that is a potential weakness when you're attracting in one type of labor pool in terms of supply, but a different type of labor demand.
So I'm trying to monitor. Thanks for sending. There's lots of questions coming in. One that's definitional, it might be useful to start with. And I know, Bethany, maybe do the unemployment and employment numbers capture Uber drivers and creator economy types? Can you talk about this affecting employment?
So we have two different, employment surveys. So we have the household and we have the payroll survey. I think the household survey would be more able to kind of capture those gig workers because they can identify that they're self-employed. And so I think on the payroll side, we're not necessarily going to capture all of those workers. So there's definitely, you can actually look at the numbers and you do see that there is a difference between those two surveys at times. I don't know if you.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, the establishment survey, so that's the number where you see like the US economy added 100,000 jobs last month. That's from the establishment survey. There has to be an establishment for them to talk to. So they could talk to DoorDash or Uber. They're not going to be able to likely talk to like the woman that makes something and sells it in an Etsy shop, right? But in the household survey, that person would show up as employed. Also, the data that comes out in JOLTS, when you see the JOLTS report, that data does not include self-employed. So the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate, that should include gig workers as long as they answer the questions correctly. But there's probably some gray area there. I will say we recently at Indeed put out a post showing that in our data even, it's interesting, only nationally the data that comes from BLS says I think it's like 5.3% of people have more than one job. But in our data at Indeed, over 15% of all job seekers have more than one job. And it's probably not surprising that for many of those job seekers, their second job is a gig job. And people are putting these on their resumes. I was a little bit surprised about that, if I'm being honest, but that percentage has gone up over time with more and more people kind of picking up gig work on the side.
So we've jumped into a lot of different topics here. So I'm going to try and we're focusing on labor markets first. We'll get to some other topics, and there's some questions on those out there. Let's focus on the demand side with labor markets. So I think we've effectively characterized generally what labor markets look like. I want to talk about a few things that stand out. The AI question comes up a lot. And maybe Laura, this is for you. The impact on hiring and employment in the region. Data centers, of course, are in discussion. I think Axios Charlotte and Axios Raleigh almost every day have an article about the growing pushback against data centers, that sort of thing. So there's a lot going on in that field. What does it look like when it actually gets to the labor market hiring?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So I joined indeed a year ago after being here with Matt and Bethany for several years. And when I first got there, people were asking us this question. Our answer really at the time was, we're not really seeing much yet. But our data updates every day, right? So if we look at it today, we can see the job postings from yesterday. So we get very much like a real-time view. Now we're seeing a lot. And actually, Aubrey Wasner's here with me. She works on my team with me, and we have a piece coming out next week on data centers that will show this. It's actually really interesting. There are a lot of data center jobs out there. They are growing very rapidly, and they are in locations where you would not think of getting a tech job necessarily. So, for example, in Jackson, Mississippi, over 10% of the job postings in Jackson, Mississippi are now for one of the top 10 tech companies. Big change, right? For those of you in the room who've been to Jackson, Mississippi, this is not a typical, it's not typical you're going to live in Jackson and work for Google or Amazon or, Meta. So it's changing. Wages are higher, which probably isn't a surprise, right? We're going to do probably a follow-up piece on the benefits packages and what those look like. But there are a lot of jobs. Those jobs are with large tech companies, but they look more like construction jobs and installation and installation and kind of equipment management jobs. But there are a lot of them. I think that what we're seeing more broadly in AI jobs is that AI right now, as far as we can see, is creating a lot of data center jobs, and then also jobs that do have AI in the title. So things like AI engineer, machine learning specialists, so things that have AI or machine learning in the title. But those more techie jobs, the jobs that are actually like tied to AI and not the production of electricity and data, are more senior level positions. So in tech specifically, we're seeing a decline in junior positions and an increase in senior level positions. If you look at those same titles across other sectors, so in finance, in accounting, in manufacturing, you're not seeing that same pattern. So there aren't jobs yet that are popping up that are called AI something. So it's going to be really interesting to watch going forward, but I will say this is happening really rapidly. Like I said, a year ago, we really wouldn't have seen much. But I do think it's something that I know the data center discussion is a very controversial one for clear reasons, I think. But at the same time, thinking about what this really means for more regional employment, because in every region, there are going to be these hot pockets of places where it's happening. I'm sure you're seeing some. Are you seeing some of the data center talk come up in your conversations?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And in places that you probably typically wouldn't think, but I think, actually recently, my dad actually went to, I guess it was kind of like a town hall about a data center coming to Spartanburg, right? So we're hearing about data centers and those data center popping up all around for sure. Mm-hmm.
With impacts on construction industry, but the one I want to ask you about, Bethany, that's probably maybe a little under the radar, but when we look at the data and we talk around the region, we can definitely see this manufacturing. And it's different in the two Carolinas, right? So when you look at North Carolina, both durable and non-durable manufacturing is off, right? And there's the long-term decline, but then even more recently, but that's not the case in South Carolina. What accounts for that difference? What do you see going on in manufacturing that's different in South Carolina?
Yeah, it's super interesting. And like you said, Matt, like manufacturing employment has been on a decline for a very long time in the United States in general, also in the Carolinas. But something that's very different about South Carolina is the type of manufacturing that is just prevalent there. So, historically, South Carolina relied on textile manufacturing, that's non-durable manufacturing, and that was a really big part of their production economy. But now things have definitely shifted toward advanced manufacturing, more durable, so like transportation equipment, machinery and things like that. And what's interesting is that this isn't a change that has just happened. This is a shift that has happened, this is decades in the making. And I think what's going on is the upstate especially is really benefiting from decisions that were made, years ago. So when textile manufacturing was on its decline, there was an intentional effort to make that shift. And I think South Carolina is a great example of a state that successfully made that shift from one version of manufacturing to the other. I think a lot of work was put in like building those relationships, especially with like foreign companies. So a lot of European manufacturers, German manufacturers. And I think that relationship that was built then is now paying off in this new economy where things like EVs, like, batteries are kind of making this, are emerging. And just this emerging technology is kind of building on the base that South Carolina already had. So it's kind of like compounding. So it's like this cluster that South Carolina has already had when it comes to durables, transportation equipment manufacturing. And I think they're really benefiting from that base that was already there. So, if you look at the data, you'll see that the composition of manufacturing in South Carolina between non-durables and durables has definitely shifted. And now non-durables continues to decline in South Carolina, but durables has definitely continued to be on the up and up, for sure.
Yeah, it really stands out. And the other thing, the other part of manufacturing that stands out to me, and I'm going to take credit for this. We have an article in I think it's our most recent Econ Focus magazine, which is an online magazine about the pharmaceutical build out in the US. A lot of that is in North Carolina. It's like you can draw a 40 or 50 mile ring around Raleigh. And I sat down one day and took all the news reports. I was like, how big is this? It was like 12 or 14 projects. I lost track once it got to 20 billion and something like 10,000 jobs or something like that. It's really fascinating. I don't know if either of you have a commentary on sort of unique sector, very specific sector build outs like that.
I mean, that's a direct reflection, to Bethany's point about decisions that were made years ago, of the decisions with the Research Triangle and Research Triangle Park and bringing those universities together to offer a really unique value add to those companies. Rock Hill, where, we lost the Panthers, but we are now gaining a large pharmaceutical biomedical manufacturer. And that, 10 years ago, you would never have seen a company like that locating in Rock Hill, South Carolina. So I think it's certainly spreading as well. I think both of you guys made really good points. I think that there are, a lot of this, when you travel around the country, actually, South Carolina is widely known for having the best workforce development program for companies who are relocating. They'll come in and create a training program for free for companies. It's very well respected. North Carolina is known for being number 2. And so for companies who are looking to come to this area and they know that they can partner with the local community college or technical college and have a program designed specifically for them. Volvo, that was why they chose to go to North Charleston when they came there, because it was just easy, right? Compared to the other places they could locate. So I totally agree. It's not random. This is like planning that really did take decades, that took a long time to pay off in some ways.
We're getting and I apologize if I won't get to all the questions. There are a lot of them. And I've already said I'm not a very good multitasker. But as I start to see some repeat, there's 2 or 3 questions about agriculture, and just wonder if there's any commentary on how agriculture fits into the Carolinas as an industry, and just kind of how it's doing. I've got some impressions, but I don't know.
Your impression? I've got some.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You go first.
There are parts that are very important. If you don't know, it's sort of agribusiness in the Carolinas. I think it was, I've been here 20 years. When I started here, and for a number of years thereafter, the number of pigs still outnumbered the number of people in North Carolina, right? So pig and chickens in particular, that's really important industry, continues to be. We grow more sweet potatoes in North Carolina than any state in the country, and it's not even close. We're like 3 times the number 2 state. The margin on sweet potatoes is almost 0, though. So I think a general state for farmers is costs are up, but pricing for their crops or proteins is not great.
Yeah.
For the pig and chicken growers, they're probably on contract pricing, so it might work a little bit. So I think there's a fair amount of stress
Yeah.
in farming. And certainly for I don't know how many smaller farms are out there, there's this issue that farmers have gotten older and the next generation isn't always going into that same field. So I think aggregation, it becomes a matter of scale.
Yeah.
So it's going to always have some importance. I don't know that it's a big growth driver, just given the
Yeah,
circumstances.
I'll also point out that Matt and I learned through our work here, one of the things I learned at the Fed is sweet potato is actually one word.
That's right.
We learned that from the Sweet
That's
Potato
right.
Council. It is serious business in Eastern North Carolina. Agree with everything Matt said. The thing I would add to that is because of the things we were just talking about, partially data centers, but also solar and other things, land use is also a big question for agriculture, right? When the next generation is considering what to do with that farm, their choice isn't just should we farm, it's could we lease this land for solar, right? Or is there a data center coming to the rural area where we could sell this land to whoever? And so I think there's also more pressures on land use. And as these communities do grow, like Bethany said, it's a double-edged sword, right? But we've all seen, I mean, gosh, central North Carolina, we're near the Toyota plant. If any of you have been up to that area, there's a lot of land that used to be farms that's now going to be subdivisions, or the Toyota plant itself, right? So land use also gets more competitive and land prices go up and the opportunity cost of farming changes.
Yeah, and also renewable mandates for utilities.
Yep.
Takes up, a farmer can lease land for solar panels and that's guaranteed income, right? So as a sort of portfolio choice, that makes sense. I'm going to try and pick up a couple other questions. We want to get on to the labor supply side, and we've talked a little bit about community colleges and stuff. But before we do that, let me get a couple interesting questions here. There's one about job growth and someone who's noting the MSA chart I showed with Wilmington being on top in North Carolina. And the question is, do we know how much of that can be attributed to small business? And I think Bethany, maybe I'll start with you, maybe not just for Wilmington, but more generally, when you break down by business where's the job growth showing up?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting feature of the employment data. When you break down employment growth by business size, you actually see that most of the employment growth we've seen recently has been for larger businesses. So for businesses with more than 500 employees. But interestingly, when you break it down even further, you'll actually see that very small businesses are doing better with employment growth. So businesses with between 1 to 50 employees, it's that middle between 50 and 500 that is seeing actually a decline in employment. So I'm not exactly sure why there's that difference within small businesses, but in general, it really is those larger businesses that are really driving the growth that we've seen recently. I actually saw some data from Indeed that showed that by job posting too, and how the growth in job postings recently have been from those larger businesses, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, and I think that some of that aligns with what we were talking about in terms of like what sectors are growing and that huge growth we are seeing in data center employment. Like those tend to be with like really large companies. So yeah, that definitely fits.
And it kind of counters a narrative though. So I think in the public sphere, particularly with tech firms doing layoffs, we've got this impression that big companies are just absolutely shedding workers.
Yeah, so two things. Tech, even if you're pretty loose with the definition, employs only about 5% of the working population. So a lot of times you guys probably have the same thing. Like I go out and do all these presentations and people are like, really doubt the fact that when I say like layoff rates are low, they are low. They're quite low right now, but that counteracts the narrative that they hear publicly. And the reality is that tech companies can be laying people off and layoffs can be low. So that those two things can happen at the same time. But also just because a big tech firm is laying people off doesn't mean it's not also hiring on the other side. And we can see that in our data. So just because, there's 10,000 layoffs at one company, that doesn't mean they're still not hiring in other parts of the business. That's really one of the things Aubrey and I are writing in our data center post is that a lot of the hiring that's happening amongst those firms is in places they didn't typically hire before and in jobs they didn't typically hire for. So the employment type has changed and location, but they're still adding people.
So far, we've been talking about the demand side. We want to talk a little bit about the supply side, right? What's happening with the labor force and some drivers there. And I'm going to start with Bethany here. We've got the two Carolinas are among the fastest growth states population-wise, right? And population doesn't necessarily mean growth in labor force. We'll get to that in time. I wonder if you can talk about what that looks like across the region. I know you've got some stuff here that we can pull up.
Yes. So kind of similarly to what we alluded to before, where we're seeing these pockets of growth. So this chart basically shows population growth between 2020 and 2025. And so the darker blue areas indicate like more population growth. And then we actually have the dark, like that red, and then that kind of peach color representing actually declines in population over time. So if you look closely, you'll see, of course, like the Charlotte area, Raleigh, Greenville, Spartanburg, also some areas on the coast in South Carolina and North Carolina. That's where we're seeing the strongest population growth. And honestly, that kind of follows that, I-85 corridor, right? So going from Raleigh down to Charlotte all the way to Greenville. So a lot of growth in some of those major metro areas, which kind of points to the fact that, we're not seeing even growth everywhere. If you look at North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, there's a cluster there that is seeing population decline of more than 2% between 2020 and 2025. So definitely different things happening in different places in the two states.
Do you want me to go to the comment in the more recent one?
This is kind of similar, just a little bit different. I do want to point to Western North Carolina, where we have seen some population loss, likely related to Hurricane Helene. So you can kind of see those red and peach areas as well. And then if you look at the coast of South Carolina, continue to see strong growth there. And so kind of similar patterns, as well as Eastern North Carolina as well, seeing some population loss too.
So how about where are these folks coming from? You have some idea? But in the context here is the last year or so, immigration policy has changed, right? So probably don't have as many coming from outside the country.
Exactly. So if you think about the whole United States, we have seen a slowdown in overall migration. So it has to be that we're taking people from other states. And so I think it's a variety of places, especially some of those higher cost metro areas. If you think about like New York City, if you think about, a lot of places in the north, honestly, like I live in Charlotte, and in my building every other day, like I just hear somebody saying like, yeah, I moved down here from New York. I moved down here from Pennsylvania. I moved down here from, Ohio. So I've been hearing a lot of those like northern areas kind of being interested in North Carolina, especially. My sister, she works at a gym in Spartanburg. And so she is able to kind of see people coming into the state. They're trying to find like a new grocery store, trying to find a new gym. And she's told me that she's been hearing about a lot of like places that she never would have thought, like Michigan, people from the West, for example, Colorado, California, so many different places. So I think it's really all over, but I think there is that, like you were saying before, Laura, we have this like, when people think about the Carolinas in the South, they think about low cost areas. They think about, being able to get more for their buck. And so a lot of people are coming from some of those higher cost metro areas in our country.
Yeah, I did an analysis on this for Greenville right before I changed jobs last year. And I looked at the top 10 counties where people were coming from into Greenville County that were not in South Carolina. And in the top 10 was Miami-Dade, San Diego, Fairfax County, Virginia. Honolulu was number 11, so I included it on the list because I thought that was cool. I think the thing that they all had in common is that they are higher cost areas. I will also say that we're not unique in this way. Like there have been migration to other parts of the country, but there's actually been some things written about some of those migration patterns kind of slowing down because people haven't necessarily, so specifically like the California to Texas move, people get to Texas and you're actually quite isolated in Texas, right? If you live somewhere in Texas, you are very far from other places. And so there's been some of that migration has actually slowed over time, whereas like being on the coast, being on the East Coast, it's easy to get up and down the East Coast. There's been more of a continuous momentum coming towards the East Coast.
We were on a internal team call and my counterpart up in Baltimore had never heard the term halfback.
Oh, really?
And it came up in the context of West Virginia, which I thought was interesting. How many, I know online you can't see, how many in this room know that term, halfback? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. So this is the Florida folks. It's too hot, too many hurricanes,
Yeah.
whatever.
New York to Florida, North Carolina.
Yeah, New York or Ohio to Florida, come back to South Carolina or North Carolina. Yeah, we're used to hearing about that here. So that's, we've talked about overall population and some migration trends. And Laura, I think I'll start with you on this one. That's population. That's not necessarily labor supply, right? Because not everybody moving here, we just talked about halfbacks. They're not all
Correct.
prime age workers.
As many, in that graph we see right there, many of those people moving to those dark blue are moving here for the intent purpose of not working.
Correct. Yeah, especially those blue ones in the South Carolina or North Carolina hurricane catcher area,
Myrtle
right?
Beach.
Yeah, for sure. So are there any other sort of dimensions of this? We're growing population. It's not all working age. Anything that our audience should be aware of in that sphere?
So recently, a colleague, Felix and I did a study where we looked at, our CEO actually asked us to predict what was going to happen to the labor force to the gap between labor supply and labor demand by 2040. And we're like, oh, wow, this is going to be easy. Nothing happening right now that'll impact that. So we did a pretty sophisticated economic analysis looking at demographic trends and what we think AI is going to do. And we varied the AI impact from like a range of where it might destroy a lot of jobs, or in fact, it could augment jobs and actually add jobs. And so we kind of built two different models. One of the very interesting outcomes from that piece was that no matter how hard we pulled on that AI lever, it was still the demographics that pulled things down faster. And I think it's very interesting because we're all talking about AI. Like everywhere I go, everybody wants to talk about AI. But what they're not talking about is the very youngest baby boomer will qualify for full Social Security in 2031. So that is an important moment. Baby boomers have worked much later in life than models would have predicted they would, but retirement is here or coming for many of them. And so in our model, one of the things that we kind of said, we put it out there, but we were a little hesitant about was that we were predicting that the labor force would begin declining this year. And in fact, it is now. So I feel a little vindicated. It might be random that it is, but it's now falling. If you saw last week's report, the unemployment rate went down, but not because more unemployed people found jobs. It went down because the labor force and labor force participation rates contracted. What's interesting about the changes to immigration policy is that that heavily impacts that as well, because immigrants on average are younger than American-born, native-born workers. And so if you do pull out a large number of immigrants out of the workforce, just by definitionally, you're going to have an older workforce. And so the fact that labor force participation rates fell is not a surprise to me. The BLS is estimating, even before the immigration policy change, they were estimating that it would fall over the next 10 years. I suspect their next projections will be even more severe. We've known this demographic cliff was coming since the birth of the baby boomers, and now we're here. And so I think over the next few years, it's going to be very interesting to watch how this happens. Places like the Carolinas are going to fare much better. I mean, if you talk to economists in Maine, they've been dealing with this already for 30 years, right? We have a younger workforce here, and we while we do have a lot of retirees moving in, we do also have a lot of working age people moving here. So it's going to be, I think, an interesting path forward as certain industries. So in our model, industries like education and health, government, manufacturing, construction are more adversely affected by these changes than many of the sectors that AI is most likely to hit like information, financial activities, business and professional services that have younger workforces. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch, kind of like that demographic shift collide with the AI shift kind of at the same time. The kind of overall sentiment from our piece, though, is the problem is not that we don't have enough jobs or that we don't have enough workers, is that we don't have enough people wanting to work in the jobs that are open. So it's convincing somebody that instead of working in finance, they need to work in construction or manufacturing. And then the time it takes to retrain people, that's the bigger issue.
Yeah, and I want to explore that more fully in just a minute. There's a question here that's interesting. I think we answered, it's two questions. We answered the first part. The second one, maybe Bethany, you can comment on this. Are people remotely working or getting new jobs at local companies? If you think about the last few years in the context of COVID, certainly remote work.
Yeah.
I can think of people who moved to the state to live in Asheville because they wanted to be near the outdoors during COVID. I can think of a couple examples. They were called back to Chicago, wherever they came from. What's your sense for what remote work looks like, either in the big metros or in some of the places that benefited from some of that pickup?
Yeah, we definitely saw a lot of that during COVID, uptick in remote work and people actually moving. Actually, we did see some benefit for some of our rural areas as people who were interested in, the natural amenities and kind of wanted a slower pace of life, and they were able to work from anywhere. We saw an influx there in some rural areas. I think now there have been quite a few, return to work mandates. So we are seeing, I feel like, a lot more hybrid than like fully remote. I think fully remote still exists and in a way that it hadn't before COVID. But I think a lot more of that hybrid, that does require people to, move closer to their actual job. So I think that's my sense of what's been happening more recently. But of course, still some level of remote work, but I think that has required people to kind of maybe move closer to the actual physical location.
I saw yesterday, and I can't remember the source, but data on this came out just like yesterday, and I saw it was like 22% of people worked remote at least one day in the last year or last week or month or however it was measured. So I think there's no doubt that there's like more flexibility now. And it was actually in an article that was kind of joking about how some of the companies that force 5-day-a-week mandated returns have now let their people work remote for the entire World Cup. It was that article, if anybody saw it, was the one that talked about this. So it's like kind of confusing. But one interesting tidbit from our data on this, we do have a remote work tracker, and that tracks hybrid and remote work. And you're right, it has kind of flatlined. It's not declining anymore. And it's about double what it was prior to the pandemic. But we do an interesting survey every year. We randomly sample 10,000 workers in the United States, and we ask them, where would you prefer to work? And how would you prefer to work? And how do you currently work? And one of the really interesting data points out of that is that the only demographic that prefers 5 days a week in office are men over age 55. But the people that desire remote work the most are people my age. They're middle-aged, like Gen Xers are most likely to really want fully remote work. The youngest workers do not want to be fully remote. They want to be hybrid. They do not want 5 days a week, but they also do not want fully remote pretty strongly. So I'm kind of the belief that this conversation is not dead. I think it's going to be very interesting when the people now who are saying, no, I want to be working remote are kind of the generation that's making some of those decisions. I'm kind of, I disagree. I think with some other economists who talk about this, but I think the conversation's not over yet. And in this data I saw yesterday, they were saying the number of people who are doing remote work at home, it went way down, and now it's like ticking back up just very, very slowly. So it's going to be interesting. It'll be interesting to watch.
And then another question we got, and I think it might have been in response to these population charts you put up, Bethany, and you highlighted the decline in Western North Carolina, probably tied to Helene. And the question is, have the negative economic impacts of Helene dissipated? What's your sense there?
I think definitely not fully. especially when I think about the return in terms of like visitorship to Western North Carolina. Tourism is a huge part of their economy. And I think there has been some growth there over the past year in terms of people coming back and going to hotels and going on trails and things like that. But there's still need for rebuilding. There's still need for just a return in terms of like small businesses coming back as well. So I don't think things, of course, have fully recovered, but I do think there has been some improvement over the past year. I think there's been a lot of effort to like put things out there, like we're ready for y'all to come back, right? So I think there's been a lot of effort there, but I don't think things have fully returned to where they were before, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, definitely better than it was. I think for like the Asheville area, October, when the fall is their big season. And I think there's a lot of anticipation of what it might look like this fall. So we'll see. Okay, so still on the labor supply side, and this will hark back to something you had mentioned earlier, Laura. So we've talked about migration, population, labor force participation, but you had talked about the skills mismatch.
Yeah.
And so I want to have a conversation about the dimensions, how bad is the mismatch, and then how we think this region is doing in addressing, and the mismatch would be there are jobs available with these skills, but we have a workforce that has different skills, and so we have to help accelerate that change to get a match.
Yeah, and that matching process is highly inefficient. And I will point out that one of the big benefits of AI, and there are big benefits from AI, is that it should improve that matching. It ought to help people take their skills. We actually have a tool now called Talent Scout on Indeed, where people can put in their resume and it'll say like, hey, have you thought about, I see your skills, have you thought about these jobs? And they might be things that people haven't thought about, right? So one of the big issues I mentioned, kind of the demographic shift. Overall, the issue is we have a large part of the workforce, the baby boomer generation, exiting out, right? And the number of people we have entering in is smaller over time. So fertility rates in the United States have been on the decline since the baby boomers. You know, I used to do this thing where I'd ask people to raise their hand, you know, if they had a bunch of siblings, and then how many people in the room had a bunch of kids. It's a much lower number, right? Baby boomers grew up in these huge families and then all had one or two kids themselves. And so fertility rates have been going down for a long time, but they had an unusual peak in 2007. And then since then, it has really been almost a straight line down. And so when I worked in higher ed, there's something called the 2025 cliff, which is 18 years after that 2007, which recognizes the period of time after which the number of people graduating high school will be on a constant decline. So this is an issue we have going forward. There will be fewer 18-year-olds nationally every single year. This impacts higher ed in huge ways, and we're already seeing it, right? There's a lot of stress, especially on the smaller independent colleges, private colleges, and regional publics. It puts stress on higher ed, but it also puts stress on these sectors that are in older sectors like manufacturing, like construction, like education and health, where there are people leaving and not enough people coming in with the skills that they need. That skills mismatch looks very different depending on where your feet are planted. If you're in a place like the Charlotte metro area, which is pretty highly diversified, the skills mismatch is not going to look as severe as if you're in a more rural place that maybe was, think about these rural places that maybe were in textiles or furniture manufacturing, and now the big plant that's coming makes EV batteries. Well, this is a big change, right? How do I get the skills to be an EV battery technician, which by the way, probably pays about $30 an hour. It's a pretty good job. But we all know as working adults, almost all of us, like, that's a hard hurdle for people to get over, right? Even if it's a short-term training program. I think that the Carolinas have done a much better job than most states of trying to fill those gaps. I think in Central North Carolina, which when we showed the 2020 to 2025, that area was one of the fastest growing areas. You know, those community colleges came together and said, we're going to train people in the same ways for these jobs and do a great job doing it. And they've been successful in that way. And you know, other parts of the Carolinas have done similar things when technology has changed. But I think this is going to be a problem that is going to get magnified with the demographic challenges because it's going to be much more, I mean, we think in our model that there are going to be some sectors that are going to see retirement rates clip at more than 4% a year between now and 2031. If that is true, and it may not be, but if our model is correct, and immigration stays as low as it is going to be a real challenge to get enough younger workers. And so I think companies are going to have to invest more heavily in places like Central Piedmont, right down the street from here, and other training institutions in their area to try to fill that gap, and also to use AI to try to make that matching process better. Because if we can take somebody, I think you were with me when I heard this story about a large airplane manufacturer coming to South Carolina. And we were talking to a staffing firm, and the airplane manufacturer needed people that could weld airplane parts. And they said, "Well, where are we going to get these people that can do that? There's not airplane welders sitting around." And they said, "We go to the local grocery store bakeries and we take the bakers because they can do the exact same skill already. We can train those people." And that's what they did. And they got these people who were making $12.50 an hour decorating birthday cakes, and now they're airplane welders. Like, the person decorating that cake would never have thought that was a jump they could have made. And it actually was a pretty easy jump. So that example always sticks in my mind as like an example of in matching. How do you make that process more efficient? Because there are people with a lot of skills that just aren't using them in the best ways.
And it highlights, I think not all, a lot of the talk about AI is it's going to displace workers. We're going to have an unemployment problem, but they're not recognizing there is this labor supply skills match thing. So you need technology to help bridge that gap.
Absolutely.
And the other thing that stands out to me is we're economists, right? We think markets eventually clear. If there's a sector where there's persistent shortage, you think the pay would eventually pick up.
In our
right?
model, we built the pay switches immediately.
Yeah.
Like, if there's a real shortage in construction and people want to build stuff, the pay will adjust. The bigger problem is, I had somebody comment to me one time, "Oh, well, I can take a financial analyst and easily turn them into a plumber, but I can't do the opposite." I'm thinking, do you know what it takes to be a plumber? I think I could make a plumber a financial analyst faster. I do think that. And so I think there's some short-sightedness on what it takes to work in some of these jobs where there are shortages. It takes a lot of training and time. And so the bigger problem is that time component, right? In our model, what we see is that people are still flowing in. The reality is, even if you look in Charlotte, which this area is doing great, job postings in banking and finance, in accounting, they're down. They're not great. Data and analytics, they're way down. All the computer science fields, they're down. And there are still a lot of students pouring into those academic programs, wanting to work in those fields. And so if that market continues to be hit hardest by AI, then you've got to convince these people that even at the same wage, do they want to go and work outside all day or stand up 12 hours a day, right? It's not just about the wage. It's also about just stigmas we have that may even be wrong about what manufacturing looks like in 2026, about the careers we thought we were going to go into. So it's still a friction-filled matching process, even if wages are fast.
Yeah. The locally here, this thought's often in my head. We've got some larger employers in the banking financial world who AI has trimmed their headcount, and they've got some other efforts underway. What's remarkable to me is we just have more banks showing up all the time.
True.
So people just find employment at a different bank where they're building out. It's this idea that we have a talent center, right? And a fast growing economy. So those kinds of firms, banks in this case, want to be here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But as Bethany said, we're probably stealing those people from somewhere else.
Yeah.
So those banks, and there are just constantly more banks coming here, but they might be closing branches 1,000 miles from here. But in this region, absolutely.
So we got some other topics, but I just want to wrap up the whole labor market. We've done supply, we've done demand and supply. Any final thoughts, Bethany? Lingering observations?
Yeah, something that came up for me when you were talking, Laura, was this whole mismatch thing at I guess sort of like at that high school level. So I think for a long time, parents preach to their kids like, go to college, you're guaranteed a good job. And so I think with just changes in the structure of our economy, the types of jobs that are actually in demand, I think that's also where it will require some reshaping in terms of people's like outlook on certain professions, like you were saying, Laura, because for a lot of younger people, maybe they may have like an aversion to like some of the skilled trades and are thinking like, no, I want to go to college, I want to get a white collar job, but maybe the demand isn't there, anymore to that degree. And so I think in terms of matching, we also need to think about things at that level as well. Like, what are people's perception, like you were saying, of these jobs of skilled trades? Because we're reaching a cliff with skilled trades, and like who's going to fill those positions? And so I think there is some shift in people's mindset towards skilled trades, especially as they see like their earning potential, for example. But I think there still needs to be some work done there in terms of like reshaping people's thought process around what type of jobs are available to me and are in demand and that will, provide me a good living and that I'd be interested in. So I also thought of that as well.
Okay, affordability is a hot topic. I think it shows up in housing, obviously the prices you see on almost a daily basis, gas and food and that sort of thing. Let me start with a question here. And Bethany, this will relate to housing prices. The question is, how can this region continue to attract those needed production manufacturing workers with housing prices high? Is there a location mismatch there? And I guess for some just context, when we think about housing in the Carolinas, are housing prices high?
Mm-hmm. So housing prices on a levels basis, if you compare the Carolinas to other states, they're comparatively lower, right? However, if you've been living in the Carolinas and you've seen the shift and you've seen the growth in housing prices over the past couple of years, that's definitely jarring. So I'll give some context on the data. So we all know that during the pandemic, we saw, lower interest rates, a flood of people into the market, lots of home price appreciation because of all of that demand. Then interest rates went up. And so then a lot of people are priced out of the housing market. And since we've seen so much population growth in the Carolinas, like that makes it even worse, like in the Carolinas specifically. So if you look at the data and you look at price growth, comparing North Carolina and South Carolina to the rest of the United States, we're seeing higher overall price growth for housing. More recently, I think it's a little bit interesting. We have seen a bit of a shift toward, things kind of going toward like the buyers and in their favor. So we're seeing, homes staying on the market for longer. We're seeing some price cuts, and that's because of home ownership affordability. If, we don't have as much demand for homes because it's so unaffordable, I think something eventually has got to give. But overall, yes, we continue on a cumulative basis. Home prices have appreciated a lot. If we compare, what home prices are today to where they were in 2019, definitely significant appreciation. But more recently, we have seen, maybe a little bit of an improvement in affordability. But of course, overall, people are buying homes at a much older age. For example, we're seeing still a lot of people priced out of the housing market, but there is maybe a bit of glimmer of hope there, seeing some improvement in affordability more recently.
What about looking forward? And I know what we're all going to say here. What's going to be our best bet to keep homes as home ownership, I think is what we're talking about, as affordable as possible. Let's set interest rates aside, right, for now. But as we think about the affordability issue, how do we solve it?
Yeah, a big part that I didn't talk about was that we have underbuilt homes for the past decade, since the global financial crisis. And so if we're dealing with this population boom and then some of the COVID dynamics, and then we're not seeing, we have this like gap in terms of like the number of homes that have been built. I think a big solution here is going to be supply and increasing the supply of homes to kind of improve things market-wise.
Yeah, I'm going to use the word that's like a bad word in many communities, which is density. It's the answer, because if you don't have density, it's very hard to have affordability. But I mean, there are places in the Carolinas, there are communities that have rules that there's actually one place I know of where you have to have 10 acres to build one house. And they put that restriction in, that kind of does away with that. There's impact fees in a lot of the places in South Carolina that make it very difficult. If there's a $20,000 impact fee per house, it's very hard to build a house. $200,000 house, that's a 10% tax. Compared to $1 million house, it would be a much lower tax rate. And so I think in many ways, density is the answer. But if you talk to home builders or people that work for local governments, they'll tell you the NIMBYism and the push against density gets stronger and stronger all the time.
It is an emotionally laden topic. I know where I live in South Charlotte, anytime a multifamily project gets proposed, it gets a lot of attention, right?
Yeah.
And most of the homes around me are above, some of them well above the median home price for Charlotte market as a whole. So I'm not sure where I live, and you can look at the data, this southern pie wedge that starts in Dilworth, Myers Park down through the even into Union County. It's just the mix of housing is probably very skewed toward the high end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that I totally understand why people get so fired up about this conversation, but the reality is that we're also having to wait through a period of time for people to reset expectations. You just talked about it with jobs, but it's also true with housing. If you think about it, for generations, people had like upgraded. Like you lived in a nicer house than your parents lived in a nicer house than your grandparents. And you talk to home builders now and they'll tell you people are choosing smaller and smaller and smaller homes. I was talking to a large home builder the other day, and he was telling me they had just created their first floor plan that was under 1,000 square feet ever, because there's high demand for that, with no garage, and they have to provide lawn care in those communities, because if you don't have a garage, you don't have a lawnmower. I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, but it's very much a resetting of expectations. So we're also waiting for that to kind of filter through.
Yeah, I now frequently when I'm out giving talks and I see people roughly my age, I'll ask them, how big was your first home you bought? And invariably it's under 2,000 square feet.
Yep.
And I know if you talk to home builders, they say there's still the land costs and the working capital just to get the lots developed and that sort. So there's some other sort of local regional policy issues, I think, that come into play there that might be interesting. So housing's one part of it. We've got a couple of questions that are along the lines. Let me see if I can find this other one. This is me being bad at multitasking here. There was a really good question. It was kind of there it is. And I want to ask this with a regional focus, but if it's, I know there's more national data on this. Is there any data or input of people facing challenges with monthly bills like utilities or rent mortgages? Bethany, any insights there?
Yeah, so some of the data we look at is just kind of trying to understand what's going on with household balance sheets or household finances. We've looked at delinquency rates, for example, for like credit cards or auto loans. So we have some data there. We have seen an uptick over the past, I'd say, around 2 years, but things have leveled off. But I think, something to pay attention to is this concept, of course, of the K-shaped economy and what's happening with lower income households versus higher income households. And I think that there is a sense of some, strain there, especially when we consider the differences in consumer patterns between those two types of households. So I think it does make sense that there probably is some underlying strain, but some interesting anecdotes that we have received is that it appears as though even though people are experiencing that strain, they're doing everything that they can to meet their obligations. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some like underlying stress that exists
Well, and I
there.
wonder if that's some of what we're picking up, like I was talking about the people holding 2 or more jobs, like we are really seeing that pick up in our data over time. And I wonder if that's a reflection of that too, right? Like 2026 is different, or nowadays is different in that if I'm not making enough money at my primary job, I could pick up like a second. You can pick up a gig economy job pretty quickly. I've forced a person to get my child to get a DoorDash job one time, and that went very quickly. You can do that very quickly. So that is a difference, but that of course presents additional stresses on families, and so that may be a sign of stress more than it is a sign of anything else.
And then got some other general macro question or two. One was about car sales. And I apologize, I can't find the actual question, but are cars going to sit on the lots till interest rates fall? I guess that you could broaden that out more, given this context, the decision-making around durable goods purchases, right? Cars. I always think of, in this region, we've got a lot of furniture manufacturing that's struggling because people aren't buying homes at the same pace. So you buy a home, you tend to buy furniture to go into that home, right? Just briefly, any thoughts on kind of that perspective?
Yeah, recently I was looking at I think it was some Bank of America data that showed like the differences in spending between household type for different income levels, and then by category. And so like clothing is still doing okay for the higher end. We're still seeing general merchandising doing okay. So consumer spending in general is okay, except for durables, which kind of points to that like forward-looking spending, or people typically when you feel more uncertain, you're probably less likely to buy that really large ticket item. So I think it speaks to some of the uncertainty that people are experiencing. But that was some Bank of America data for a specific month.
Yeah, I think too, like durable spending did quite well coming right out of the pandemic. And some of those purchases, like if you did buy a car then, or you bought a new refrigerator or a sofa or whatever, that's why they're called durable goods, right? You can hold on to these things longer. So I think you're right that uncertainty would really freeze up those purchases much more commonly than they would non-durables, because you don't have to necessarily upgrade or buy new.
Question just came in. It's related to housing. What are we seeing about affordability as it relates to renting? I've got one anecdote, and we do talk to a bunch of multifamily folks. At least we've got some folks in the room that know about this. I just signed a lease for my daughter out in Chapel Hill, 2 free months rent, and I understand that in this region, and I think the Carolinas certainly the larger metros in the Carolinas, that's kind of a common feature right now. So I think rent growth's pretty soft. It depends probably where you are though, right, Bethany? There's, South End Charlotte is probably not cheap.
I was looking at, I think even in South End, because I'm maybe in the market for my son as well, or to help him. He can pay for it, but there are free periods of time too.
Yeah.
One thing I will say that I think is also interesting, we get asked a lot at Indeed about new graduates, recent graduates and young workers.
We just had a question about that.
Okay, well, we are seeing some different impacts there, but the folks that are graduating like from business schools, computer science degrees, those students are having to like search kind of for longer and harder on our site than they used to, for sure. But there's also been some data that shows more new grads are moving back home with their parents. And so that impacts the multifamily market pretty heavily too. Like if household formation is declining because young people are residing with their parents more frequently, you'll see that really impact multifamily.
It's interesting, and I've heard this from property managers with portfolios of multifamily, that yes, they aren't seeing that trend's real. They also aren't seeing roommates split up as much. Some of whom might go on to buy a home, and so the other roommate has to rent separately. And so the average income of the renters they're seeing is actually going up because they're not becoming homeowners.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Which I find it very interesting. Okay, we're almost out of time. So to wrap this up, I'll ask each of you your final thoughts we set this up as kind of a forward-looking discussion. So how do you think this region will fare as we look ahead, maybe the rest of this year and into 27?
I think, as I said before, this region is going to fare very well relative to the rest of the United States. I do think going forward, this happened on Friday for me. On Friday nationally, there was a stat, the leisure and hospitality lost a bunch of jobs, and that was surprising to a lot of people. And I was getting all these questions like, oh, I would thought demand would be high because of the World Cup, because of the 250th birthday of the United States, blah, blah, blah. And I had to point out that this might not be about labor demand anymore. This might be about a shortage of labor supply. And so I think if you do see pullbacks in certain areas in this region, you should question yourself on whether that's actually a sign of demand or a sign of that skills mismatch and labor supply shortages that we talked about before.
Yeah, I'd echo what you said, Laura. I think the outlook for the Carolinas is definitely promising. One thing that stands out to me employment-wise is that if you look at employment growth for the Carolinas versus the rest of the United States, you'll see that the narrative for the United States has been that healthcare has been the main driver for employment growth overall. So if you have a degree or have some sort of qualification in healthcare, you're great. But for other industries, things aren't looking so good. But in South Carolina and North Carolina, even though employment has slowed somewhat over the past year, there's a lot more variety in the types of jobs that are being added. And I think that really speaks to just some of the resilience in the Carolinas, and also our ability to attract a variety of industries to our state, and just the momentum that we're seeing there. So I think it's just very promising given that.
Great. So I want to first have us all thank our two panelists. So locally, can you clap? Appreciate your time and your insights. That's terrific. There's also, as you might imagine, a larger team that helps pull these events together. You can't see or necessarily know who they are, but I want to express my appreciation for them. And let me see if I'm going to do my stuff here. Okay, so this slide is just a prompt for me to say, we do other events, and we're going to do another one of these here in Charlotte. We're also doing them elsewhere throughout our district. Not necessarily even in our office locations. My Baltimore colleague is going to venture out into West Virginia to do one of these. Some of them will be general economics, some will be, I think, topical. We have other events that are coming up. We're actually pretty heavy on events in the Carolinas the latter half of this year. So if you're not on our mailing list, please do get on that so you can know what those are. And then I think, and I'm going to make sure I get everything here, is this? Yes. We conduct monthly surveys. Happy to get new survey participants. And I think this slide, there's a QR code if you want to do that. I think there will also be an event survey for this event. Your questions and provide a lot of input maybe as we think about our local event coming this November. That might be topical, so keep that in mind. We'll comb through the output from this event to see what might be really useful and of interest. So pay attention to that. And I'm gonna just make sure, have I covered everything? I've got a thumbs up. Thank you all for being here, folks online and in person. This has really been terrific. I've enjoyed this quite a bit. And I hope you have a good afternoon and evening. Thank you very much.